Greetings, friends. I hope you're excited to continue our study in the book of Joshua. We're going to pick up where we left off in Joshua chapter 5, beginning in verse 2, actually, and going through verse 12. We're not going to finish the chapter because I believe the last paragraph of chapter 5 really goes with the story of chapter 6. And so it'll start a conversation that we're really not ready to have just yet. That'll be for next time if you'll join us then. But in Joshua chapter 5, verses 2 through 12, we see that Israel has finally crossed the Jordan into the land of promise. But before they begin the conquest of the land of Canaan, they need to be ready spiritually. You see, the first thing they're going to do when they get across this Jordan River, as they did in chapter 4, and they set up these memorial stones to commemorate and remember this crossing miraculous event, the very next thing they're going to do is prepare and take care of spiritual matters. Now, this is going to seem like a really strange time to do this, especially from a military perspective. They're going to have their backs to a raging river and have no fortresses or forts or defense of any kind for several days as they sit here very close to the city of Jericho and their enemies. But in God's timetable and in His order of importance, they need to be ready spiritually as well as physically. You can't ever leave the spiritual out of it. Now, they're going to do physical things in this chapter, but the physical things are closely connected to spiritual matters and really illustrate the tone of this book. This is not just about conquering the land of Canaan and taking their stuff. This is about Israel being the chosen people of God, ready to carry out God's mission and be His nation of priests who serve and trust Him faithfully so they can be that shining light to all the nations. It's bigger than just conquering the land. So let's get in and read a little bit and read our text. And I hope you'll open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 5. I'm going to begin reading in verse 2. It says, "At that time," this would be right after the crossing, "the Lord said to Joshua, 'Make for yourself flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time.' So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haraloth. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that He would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children whom He raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not circumcised them along the way." So we're going to stop there for a moment before we keep going. It is a little bit lengthy description of exactly what's going on, but I appreciate that it says this is the reason why we're doing this. It leaves no doubt here in this text is the exact reason why they're being circumcised at this moment in time. You see, the nation of slaves that God rescued from their captors in Egypt who were being brutally and terribly treated there, that nation, that people, they got His laws and they partake of His miracles, but they would not listen to the Lord. And so because of their rebellion on multiple occasions, God swore, "I'm going to give it to your children instead of to you." And so that nation was circumcised and did many of the practices that God commanded in the Torah, in the law. Circumcision going all the way back to Abraham in Genesis 17. And it being a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham and to his descendants. But their children had not been circumcised along the way. I find this strange, to say the least, because it was so important for Israel culturally, that the males be circumcised on the 8th day. So we find here that the nation that's about to take the promises of God finally and partake of all the promises God has promised to their forefathers from hundreds of years back, that they are not spiritually ready or in obedience to the commands God set up with their great forefather Abraham. That they are not circumcised, that they are they have broken the covenant, as it were. Let's go ahead and read Genesis 17. I'm going to put my bookmark here at Joshua 5. We'll take just a moment and look at the original covenant of circumcision. I believe that would be beneficial for us. So jump back, if you would, all the way in the beginning of your Bible, Genesis chapter 17, and take a look beginning at verse 6. God is in the middle of a conversation speaking to Abraham, the father of the Israelites and many other nations. And God is making a covenant with Abraham, a promise and an agreement, a mutual agreement there. He says in verse 6, going through verse 14, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after me the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So God is saying, Abraham, I'm going to make you a father of many nations. All kinds of people are going to come from you, and famous peoples and whole nations and kings. And I'm going to give them the land of Canaan for their own possession, for an age-lasting possession. It says, and God further said to Abraham in verse 9, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. Verse 10, this is key. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. Even a servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall also surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people, because he has broken my covenant. Now, there's just two or three things I want to grab from this text. This text is very rich in things, but we're not really studying Genesis right now, or Abraham. But one thing is God made this covenant with Abraham and his descendants at this moment, even though those descendants didn't exist yet. Abraham had no children at this time. What that means is the Israelite people were born into that covenant. Now, they're circumcised on the 8th day, but that child's already in covenant, because circumcision is the sign of that covenant. It's the marker. So if you're not circumcised, you have broken the covenant. But circumcision in and of itself is not the covenant per se. It's the sign of it. But if you're not willing to get the sign of the covenant and become marked as one of God's chosen people, then you have broken the covenant, if that makes sense. So, turning back to Joshua, they have not been circumcised, and they're about to partake of the promise God made to Abraham back in Genesis 17, what we just read, to get the land of Canaan as their possession, but they are, in essence, breaking the covenant at this moment. So before they take possession, the first thing they're going to do on this side, on the Canaan side of the Jordan, is to get back right spiritually with God through the covenant of circumcision. I hope that all made sense there before we move on, because they're going to take Passover next, also extremely important. One final note on the circumcision thing. God is specific and says, make flint knives and circumcise the nation of Israel with that instrument. Now you think, why is that important? Well, little details that show up in the Bible are never unimportant. Now, they may be less important than some of the big details, but they're never there haphazardly. One thing we know now with really powerful microscopes is that with primitive means, there's only basically one way to sharpen a flint knife or to even make a flint instrument of any kind. It's to nap it or chip it away. Well, when that really hard flint or obsidian as well, and you can even do it with glass, but flint is especially good. When it's chipped away, the way it shatters and you make that blade, it can shatter down to a 1 molecule wide edge, which is far sharper than anyone can ever sharpen a steel or iron or let alone bronze instrument. The way the molecules are arrayed and the sharpening method and the crystalline nature of iron and other metals doesn't allow them to get that sharp. And so the sharpest instrument used for the finest surgeries, even today, especially for brain surgery where scar tissue is so important to not have much of, flint scalpels are used. Because incisions and cuts with flint scalpels leave behind far less scar tissue. They hurt far less. And they make less jagged wounds, making a wound that heals much faster, a wound that causes much less damage. And it's really amazing and shows the wisdom and knowledge of God that He wants them to, in essence, go back a step technologically and use flint knives for their surgery here. Because metal was well known at this point in history, both bronze, copper, and even iron as well. So we're just getting into the iron, but from what we can tell archaeologically, metal was well known at this point and used extensively for all kinds of instruments. So, little nugget there. If you're interested in studying that further, I would look at some websites. Have here, you can look at NCBI, at Mountain Mineral Monthly, volume 63, number 6 from June 1994 has an article on it, and there's some other things as well. If you're interested in those and you would like some further information on that, I encourage some search, some looking. It shouldn't be hard to find on Google or anything else. And if you can't find anything, you can email me or leave a comment, and I'll post a link. Well, let's get on in Joshua 5. There's a few more verses left yet. And there's some important things, other spiritual matters that they're going to take care of. So continue reading with me, if you would, in verse 8 through verse 12. It says, "Now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you.' So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. Now, when they crossed the Jordan, they camped by a place called Gilgal. But you must remember, it's important to try and memorize the timeline, if you would, or at least be aware of it. With the history of Joshua was recorded after the events had taken place, and this information, this history, would be given to the children and descendants of this generation that did that. That would make sense. The generation that experienced these events would have no need for a written record. And so when the author says they crossed the Jordan and camped at Gilgal, they absolutely camped there. But its name wasn't Gilgal until the next chapter, because it was named that because of the events that happened, if that makes sense. So it's retroactively called what the audience reading it will understand. Just like if we were talking about Texas or American history, we could say, well, the settlers moved along this river and camped at this valley, and the first white settlers camped at this mountain range called what's and so. Well, the mountain range might have not been named that yet, but we know where that is on the map, and so it's exactly what happened. But the naming of the events, it may not be in the order of the actual people there, if that makes sense. So it's named Gilgal because of the events that happened in chapter 5, but they camped at a place called Gilgal in chapter 4. Hope that wasn't too confusing and not that important. But the name Gilgal here means rolled or rolling. And you think, why would you name a place rolling unless it's in Texas and it's rolling hills or something? But here it's a different matter. He says, because the Lord says to Joshua in verse 9, he says, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And so the place was called Gilgal, which means rolling. So this place where they camp, there's something that happened here which shows that God has rolled away the reproach of Egypt. Now, Unlike with the really in-depth description of exactly why they were circumcised, we don't get a whole paragraph or section describing exactly what God meant when he said, I'm rolling away the reproach of Egypt. And so it's left a little bit open to us, not to them, but to us, as to what God meant by the reproach of Egypt that he was rolling away. To me, the thing that makes the most sense is that numerous times in the books preceding this, in Exodus and Deuteronomy and in Numbers, and if you want to look up these passages, it's Exodus 32:12, Exodus 32:12, Numbers 14:13 through 16, and Deuteronomy 9:28. Now, at these instances are various times when God was so done with his people because of their wickedness and their lack of trust and just rebellion in general. He said, I've had it with these people. Moses, he was generally speaking to Moses at the time, and said, I've had it with these people. I'm going to wipe them away, and I'm going to start with you and keep my promise, but I'm going to start with you and make a new generation, because these people are just not, they're just not compatible. They're just not, they just won't obey. They just won't trust and just obey me. I would bless them, but they just won't. They want to be wicked. But Moses reminds God in these instances and says, God, if you wipe out these people, please don't wipe out these people. If you do, the nations around, like Egypt and the place where we came from and the places where we're going, those nations are going to see and hear and say, God wasn't great enough to bring a wicked nation into the land he promised. God wasn't powerful enough. He says, please spare them. Give us more time so that your name won't be dragged through the dirt by these other nations. So it'll prove that you are the God you say you are. Now, God powerful enough to raise up another generation from Moses and fulfill his promise. But God listened to Moses, his servant, and didn't destroy them, which shows the great mercy of God for people that really didn't deserve it. And so here, the reproach of Egypt is rolled away. The best response, or the best, I guess, theory you can call it, I have for that from my study is that God has proved now that Israel has crossed the Jordan, that they're in covenant again, they've been circumcised. God has proved that he is powerful enough to bring a nation of slaves, rebellious, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. I encourage you to read the Pentateuch again if you haven't in a while, or you never have. And you might be amazed at the stubbornness of this people. But God is faithful and merciful and wise, and he leads them all the way. And now he's gotten them into the promised land he promised their forefather Abraham hundreds of years before. And so their reproach is now rolled away. To me, that's the best explanation of what's going on here. I admit that I could be wrong, and I encourage you to do your own study, as always you should. But the place is named Gilgal because the reproach of Egypt has been rolled away. Last couple of verses here, verses 10 through 12. It says, while the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain, and the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. So the very next thing they do after circumcision, about 3 days later, if you read at chapter 4:19, you see they cross the Jordan on the 10th of the month. And so here on the 14th, which is when you're supposed to start Passover here in the spring, they partake of the Passover for the first time in the Promised Land. And also, at that same time, the manna ceases because they start receiving provisions from the land itself. Some parched grain and some crags, some simple food to be sure, but they no longer need the manna. Now, the manna would be nice. An army marching into foreign land which didn't have to worry about providing food for itself would have a tremendous advantage. But God removes it now because they no longer need it. I think there's a lesson here about the miracles and the works of God. God's wonders and his miracles always have a purpose. They always have a reason. And when that need expires, that reason God did the miracle, it is my belief, and based on numerous texts and examples from the Bible, this being one, that then the miracle is taken away because it's no longer needed. You see, why are miracles done in the first place? Why are any of God's actions and words taken? It's to get us to trust him. Well, for a nation of slaves living in a barren wilderness with no support of any kind and no food, depending on the very water that God brings forth from the ground to survive, the manna sustains them for 40 years. It's a great blessing that enables God to sustain a large population of hundreds of thousands of people in a barren wilderness with no crops and just very little herds, and you can't eat your herds or they'd be gone soon, no refrigeration and such. And so God's manna sustains his people in the wilderness. But they're not in the wilderness anymore. And so if God continues to sustain them with manna, they'll have no incentive to take responsibility, to grow crops, to get to the next level of trust, if you will. They can just rely on the manna. And so God removes it so they can grow in their trust, because it would be a handicap if he left it. And so I believe most of God's miracles work in that manner, that they achieve their purpose, and it's wonderful and amazing when it happens. But when that need expires, so too does the miracle, it seems to me. So, kind of a discussion for another time and in other places. But here, we'll leave here at verse 12 and talking about the Passover, that here they are, that the nation of Israel has now crossed the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. They have been circumcised. They're in agreement. They're no longer in trespass against the covenant God made with Abraham, their forefather. They have now partaken of the Passover and re-commemorated and realized the Exodus from Egypt when God spared the firstborn children. They are spiritually ready to proceed with the conquest of Canaan. Now, they've done all this not far, maybe even almost within sight of the city of Jericho and the garrison and the king and his soldiers there. So, strategically, their move has not made any sense by any tactical or military strategy. They have been sitting here with their backs to a raging river with no escape in a foreign country without having advanced anywhere. And they've done surgeries on themselves and they've feasted. So strategically, nothing they have done would make sense. But it shows the great weight of the spiritual matters that need to be attended to. Because now is the time when they need to get spiritually right before they take the conquest. Because God's going to be the one fighting the battles for them. And they need to be right with him. So I guess the lesson for us to take away would be, let's get spiritually right before we engage in great battles. Before we engage in great, difficult, life-changing decisions or actions. Being spiritually ready is more important than being physically ready. By all means, be physically ready. But if you're not spiritually ready, then how could you expect God to give you success, to bless your journey? So being spiritually ready for whatever life decision or event or action, maybe you're going to move, maybe you're going to do a new job, maybe you're going to start a new ministry, whatever it is that's going on in your life, I encourage you to seek God and get spiritually ready before you take those actions. I think we could learn from Joshua in that respect. I thank you for your attention. I hope to see you again next time. Hope you're enjoying our study. But until then, I pray you stay in the Word and you stay in prayer, and hope God blesses you.